All right. Thank you very much, Claes, for that kind introduction, and to Valentina for putting together this very interesting program of speakers today and for inviting me to be a part of it. So today I was asked to talk about two European grants that we're working on that are both sharing the theme of how we can build better research. And one, the EXCELScIOR project, focuses on doing this by building a meta-research team. And the other focuses on reforming graduate incentives to embed openness and reproducibility in the way that graduate students are assessed and rewarded. So I'll start off with the EXCELScIOR grant. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm the team leader for the new EXCELScIOR team in meta research. And EXCELScIOR stands for Excellent Science with Impact, Open, and Reliable. And this grant was written by others before I was hired to lead this team, specifically Paulo Oliveira and Elsa Enriquez at the University of Coimbra, who are the coordinators for the grant, and the ERA Chair holder, who is John Ioannidis. And then the team is also supported by our project manager, Raquel Rodriguez. So what is the goal of having a meta-research team? Why do we need one? Well, at the University of Coimbra, the meta-research team is embedded in the biomedical research environment, although it has goals to expand and to look at and develop research across the university in different areas as well. And in the biomedical space, we know that there are many different types of research that researchers do. There's preclinical or animal studies, there's basic science or bench or fundamental research, and then there are clinical trials that are on actual patients. And a small amount of the insights gained from these studies eventually filters out into translation, into reforming and changing and improving healthcare for patients. But much of the research that we do actually is wasted. There may not be clear results at the end of the day that lead to improvement in patient care. And there are many reasons for this. Some of this waste is preventable, some of it isn't. And our goal isn't necessarily to create an environment where there is no waste, but it's to reduce waste that is perhaps preventable and not productive. There are many different problems that we can have as part of the scientific process that can lead us to results that aren't trustworthy or that don't reproduce when we conduct follow-up studies and try to confirm those results. This is a well-known figure that just lists a few examples of these. So for example, when we're generating or specify hypotheses, we may fail to control for important biases. When we're designing a study, perhaps there are design flaws such as low statistical power, so we don't have enough participants or subjects to answer the research question. When we are collecting data, perhaps we're not doing that as well as we could be. Maybe the data collection that we're using is of poor quality and isn't giving us reliable results that we can be confident in. When we're analyzing data and testing our hypotheses, we may have procedures like p-hacking, which are likely to give us spurious results that will not be reproducible. And the same procedures can apply to interpreting results. There are also problems with harking, which is an acronym for hypothesizing after results are known. So when we do exploratory research, which is designed to generate new hypotheses, we present that research as though we are confirming those hypotheses instead of conducting follow-up studies separately to confirm our findings. And the last thing is about how we publish or conduct our next experiment. If we're not publishing results that don't confirm our hypotheses, then this can lead to publication bias, which distorts the evidence that we see when we read the literature to make decisions about patient care or about other aspects of our research. So it was with all of these things in mind that the EXCELScIOR grant was written, and this grant focuses on transforming research at the University of Coimbra and further developing an already excellent research environment. So the grant asks questions like, is research at the university competitive, open and transparent, and efficient? How can we maximize the impact of research that's done at the university? And how can we develop novel methods of rewarding the best research practices when we're thinking holistically about all of the things that make research rigorous and of high quality and likely to be trustworthy and reproducible? The EXCELScIOR grant is an ERA Chair grant, and these are grants that are funded by Horizon Europe in order to develop the research potential by bringing a new research field and international expertise into widening countries. And so in the case of the EXCELScIOR grant, the goal is to develop the potential of research at the University of Coimbra by creating a team that's dedicated to meta-research. And this team will promote the reproducibility and interdisciplinarity of research and work towards making research more efficient by better use of data, better verification, more transparent, and more responsive to societal needs. So I've been using the term meta-research a lot, and for many people it's a new term. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what meta-research is. And essentially, meta-research is research on any aspect of the research process or the research ecosystem. So we might start by thinking about the composition and behavior of the research community. So who does research and who gets to do research, who gets funding, who gets to do studies, influences the type of research that is done. So when we have systemic biases that are altering the composition of our community, that influences the research that we do, and it also determines who benefits from that research. The next thing is the choice of research topic, and as I just addressed, who does the research influence what research is done, which can also influence who benefits from that research. So these things are clearly connected. The next thing is the design and methodology of specific research studies. So if we have problems consistently in the design of our studies, that may make them less rigorous and less likely to be trustworthy or to be reproducible. We then want to think about the description and interpretation of the results. So where do we share our results? How do we describe them? How are we publishing and disseminating our work? Who has access and who doesn't? And what are we learning from the results of our research? Are there ways that we could do this better or more effectively? And then the last piece is the way that we assess researchers through funding decisions, through hiring and promotion decisions, because those things, again, have an impact on the composition and behavior of the research community, which starts the entire cycle again. And all of these things, research on all of these different topics, can be classified as meta-research or research on research or the science of science. There's no single method for doing meta-research. Meta-researchers borrow techniques from many different fields that are appropriate to answer your research question. So there may be a lot of people who are working with bibliometric studies, with systematic reviews, or with meta-analyses. Meta-researchers also do intervention studies to determine whether introducing a particular intervention or change in practice is effective and leads to the outcomes that we would like to see. You might also see qualitative studies, focus group survey studies, or Delphi studies to build consensus around the best ways of doing things. And there are many more techniques that meta-researchers use depending on the research questions that they're asking. When you're starting in meta-research, you often have a very small toolbox of maybe 1 to 2 methods that you need for your first study. And as you conduct many research studies, you build a larger toolkit for conducting meta-research and learning different methods. And if you'd like to learn more about the different methods that are used in meta-research, you can check out the Meta-Research Methods channel on our YouTube where we have a series of talks where researchers have shared a meta-research they've conducted with an intensive focus on how they implemented the particular method that they use and what others should consider if they're thinking about using that method. One thing I'd really like to clarify is that meta-research is not the same as meta-analyses. These both start with meta, and so people sometimes get confused. So as we've discussed, meta-research is research on any aspect of the research process or the research ecosystem. Meta-analysis is a very specific method for synthesizing evidence, where we bring together all of the studies that have looked at a particular research question, and we then analyze the evidence from those studies as a whole to see what the literature says as a whole instead of looking at the result of a single individual study. So when we do a meta-analysis, we're combining the results of all of the studies to assess the size and the direction of an effect, and that's very different from meta-research, which is research on the research process or ecosystem. So this is a lot of words. I think it's important to talk about what does this actually mean? What does meta-research look like in practice? And I'd like to highlight a brief example from our own research, and there are many others. This is just one example of the types of things that we can do in meta-research. So my first meta-research study, I was very concerned with the problem of using bar graphs to present continuous data. And the reason that I wanted to spend time focusing on data presentation or data visualization is that data presentation is really the foundation of our collective scientific knowledge. So oftentimes data and code aren't shared along with the paper, and that means all that we will ever know about a data set that is or a study that was conducted is contained in the figures that the author presented and the paper that the author presented. And the figures are especially important because authors often use those to show the data for their most important findings. And if we are making systematic errors in the types of figures that we use, if we're using figures that obscure or conceal information, then that has an impact on what we will know about that research study and our ability to evaluate that study for all of the future. And nobody wants to be responsible for ruining the future. So my interest in data presentation specifically came from my research in preeclampsia. So at the time, I was a physiologist studying the pregnancy complication preeclampsia, which is a leading cause of death for both moms and babies. And one of the problems that the field was facing at the time was we knew that there were a common set of symptoms that women had at the end of the disease, but the way in which women got to those symptoms was very different for each individual. So there could be problems and pathophysiologies that were happening with the mother, with the fetus, or with the placenta. And that meant that for any woman that we were looking at, or for any biomarker or pathophysiological process that we thought might be relevant to preeclampsia, some women with preeclampsia would have very abnormal results for that pathophysiological process, and other women would have completely normal results. And the field was really focused on how do we identify women with specific pathophysiologies so that we can match pathophysiologies to treatment to provide a cure for this disease. Unfortunately, there are no subgroups of patients in a bar graph. Bar graphs are what we show when we want to mask heterogeneity. When we want to understand heterogeneity, we need to see the data that underlines that graph in the individual data points. So that led to this paper, and this was published in PLOS Biology in 2015. It was my first meta-research paper, and in this, what we did was we just looked at a lot of papers. Every original research article that was published in one of the top 15 physiology journals over a 3-month period to see what kind of figures they were using to present their continuous data. And this paper was viewed more than 100,000 times in the first month that it was published, and it subsequently went on to contribute to policy changes in many journals, and it's also often used by editors and peer reviewers when they are requesting improved data visualization or when they're implementing policy changes within their journal. And we're currently doing meta-research to see whether or not those policy changes have actually had an impact on the way authors visualize their data in papers. So what did we do in this paper? As I mentioned, this was a systematic assessment of about 700 papers that were published in physiology journals over a 3-month period. We looked at everyone to see what type of graphs they were using, because that's what jet lag and transatlantic flights are for. And when we did this, we found that almost all papers are using bar and line graphs to present continuous data. And unfortunately, these figures make it impossible to critically evaluate the data because we can't see the underlying data points, how many there are, or how they're distributed. And our conclusions may be very different depending on the answers to those questions. So many different data sets can lead to the same summary characteristics, but the underlying distributions can be quite different. We also found that the sample sizes were very small, in most cases less than 10 independent observations per group, that the error bars were almost always used to show standard error. So in 70% of cases, error bars were showing standard error, which tells us about the precision of the mean. Only 16% of the time, authors were using error bars to show the standard deviation or the variability in the data. And we found that this practice of presenting bar graphs of continuous data was so ingrained that more than 50% of papers that were using non-parametric analyses presented data that they had analyzed non-parametrically as mean and standard error or mean and standard deviation. And this is a concern because we typically use non-parametric analyses when the sample size is too small to understand what the data distribution is, or we might use it when we know that the data distribution isn't normal, and so the standard error and standard deviation and the mean are not appropriate. And if you'd like more information on why bar graphs of continuous data are a problem and what to use instead, there's a visual Q&A that's available at the QR code that you can access to answer that question. Okay, so let's talk about meta-research at the University of Coimbra. As I mentioned, the EXCELScIOR grant is setting up a team to evaluate and conduct meta-research within the university. And we have researchers who have been recruited from all different fields, which is really great because it allows us to cover different topics of meta-research and to connect with researchers in different areas in the university. So we have, for example, Teresa, who is from biochemistry and molecular biology. Thomas is a computational sociologist who focuses on studying funders and grant peer review processes and looking at different models for grant peer review. Priya is a psychologist looking at replication studies. Alfredo is actually a biologist, so he works with birds and he has a strong interest in evidence synthesis and meta-analysis. Inej is a junior researcher with a background in psychology and neuroscience, and she is currently working on research assessment reform. Tashome has a background in statistics and meta-research, and we have a new PhD student working with us, Korotul, who is focusing on research question shifts when we reuse data from clinical trials. EXCELScIOR has a lot of priorities. The first is to build local and national meta-research capacity. We're also thinking about ways to improve the quality of methods reporting and to identify common problems and beneficial practices in publications using automated screening tools. We are looking at ways to improve research assessment and identify knowledge gaps to improve the impact of research, as well as establish guiding principles for responsible data reuse. For our educational framework, we are focused on providing hands-on training in open science, responsible research, and in meta-research, as well as organizing conferences and unconferences. And to give example of this, in June, we ran a summer school in Germany where 28 young researchers from all different fields and countries came and worked for the week with experienced instructors to design meta-research studies that they are now working on completing. Okay, so I'd now like to talk about the Treasure Project, and this is one of the key projects that we're focusing on in the EXCELScIOR team, and it's about how we transform research assessment through responsible research training of early-stage researchers. And this work is led by Inej Almeida, and I've actually borrowed her slides for the next section of this talk. So we all know that when we're in graduate school, there is a very, very long road to getting your master's or your PhD. And at the end, you are rewarded with your degree for completing a research study and perhaps publishing one or more research papers. The problem with that is that there are many different products that researchers produce along the way that are also really valuable outputs, but that aren't recognized or rewarded by the system. And so I'll give you an example of some of these things. And here you can see we start off by designing our study. So often there's a protocol for the study or there's a proposal. And that is the first thing that we produce. We then may have some some step-by-step protocols that specifically define particular methods that are used to conduct the study. We have a variety of materials that we might be using to do the study, and sometimes we create new materials in order to conduct the research. We might have some software and code, and that could be software and code that we're developing to help us to do the research or to analyze the data. And we also have some data that are created as a result of the study. And all of these, again, are valuable outputs that researchers create that can be reused by others, and yet graduate students aren't rewarded for creating those outputs, and they aren't accessible in many cases to the broader research community. So Treasure is really designed to address this fundamental problem. Our goal is to pilot a new recognition and reward system with graduate students at the university, and we want to do this by developing an opt-in program that is interdisciplinary and transversal to the university. We want to train and support and reward the implementation of reproducible, reusable, and open research in masterate and doctoral thesis research. We want to value a diverse set of practices and outputs based on quality. And the reason is that different outputs apply to different fields, and we have very different fields across the university, so we need to have practices that apply to all of those fields. And then we want to offer a badge or a formal recognition that's additional to the applicant's degree to recognize the work that they've done to make their research reproducible, reusable, and open. So what's our aim in terms of impact? Well, we want to develop knowledge and skills for the future generation of researchers on how to make their research more reproducible, reusable, and open. And we want them to have demonstrated evidence in their research that they can show that they have the capacity to produce these outputs, to share these outputs, and to implement these practices. We'd also like to encourage supervisors and other researchers within the university to adopt these new practices. So we hope that by rewarding graduate students, we will start to see the practices spread to other areas of the university. And long term, we hope to transform the badge and reward criteria into hiring and promotion criteria for the university so that these skills are being recognized in positions beyond graduate.
Tracey, I think we lost you.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Well, people who are involved in faculties and students all provided us with critical input. We also have an
Tracey,
external advisory board with other external experts from around the world who are sharing expertise, providing advice, and helping us to solve problems. And we have experts from other institutions who have expertise with these practices who have helped us to develop our criteria. And lastly, for coordinating and sharing knowledge, we're working with the wider university community, and that includes the core team who's working on the Treasure project, as well as institutional leaders and stakeholders. So our local advisory board, as I mentioned, they come from many different faculties, course programs, and R&D units. And just to give you an example of the diversity of programs we have represented, we have inclusion of disciplines like anthropology, classic studies, food heritage, biochemistry, biology, economics, information science, law. We have strong representation from medicine and the health sciences, pharmacology, psychology, as well as sports sciences. The timeline for the project, we began in 2025, and our first task was to co-create a list of the assessment criteria and the procedures together with our community. And this has taken a lot of time, but it's been a great learning experience and really interesting for us to think about how these different practices and outputs might apply to different research fields. We've also worked to identify training resources to support our students in implementing these practices, and we're currently in the phase of launching and advertising the program. This was scheduled for the summer, but no one signs up for anything over the summer, so we're doing it in the fall instead. So we're about to open and enroll in the enrollment in the program, and we'll be providing training and support for students as they embark on implementing these new practices. And we hope that that will help us learn more about the challenges that researchers face when they implement practices across different fields. And we will use that information to further enhance and adapt the program. So what have we created? Well, the first thing that we have that's available to you is a list of the criteria and the procedures for the programs. And we've divided the things that we're recognizing, the things that students can do, into both practices and outputs. Practices are things that students do in their thesis, but they don't necessarily immediately result in outputs, whereas outputs are things that have an identifier and are accessible on a trusted repository. And the intent is never that students to do all of these things. Generally speaking, students need to do 2 or 3 of these things in order to achieve the badge, so that everyone does a little bit more and people can select practices that are particularly relevant for their field and their research project. So the practices include things like credit author contribution statements that specify the contribution of each author to the research study, the use of unique identifiers like research resource identifiers that specify exactly what resource or material was used. Stakeholder engagement, citizen science, and participatory research is quite important at the University of Coimbra, particularly in certain fields, so that's something that we're working to recognize, as well as science communication activities, including dissemination and policy recommendations. We're also looking at rewarding researchers for using evidence synthesis technique like systematic review or meta-research in order to assess the quality of evidence and identify research gaps when they develop their research question. We want to reward researchers who report null results or results that don't support their hypothesis, who follow reporting guidelines when they are writing up their study for publication, or who conduct pre-registered reproducibility or replication study. In terms of the outputs that we're rewarding, these include pre-registration or study design plans, researchers who do registered reports, so who get their study design peer-reviewed and published before they start conducting the study, so that the study is accepted based on the quality of the methods as opposed to the interestingness or surprisingness of the result. We're also rewarding researchers for sharing open step-by-step methods and protocols that specify exactly how specific procedures were performed to make research more reproducible and promote reuse of those protocols by others, as well as researchers who share their data, who share open source code and software, and other open and reusable materials and resources. We also recognize researchers who make their research available sooner by sharing preprints that haven't yet been peer-reviewed before publishing their research, or who produce and release open educational materials. And each of these practices and outputs is assessed based on quality. There is a set of minimum standards, and we focus on the process of implementing these practices in the research. And students are provided with a comprehensive guide that helps them learn what exactly the practice is and how they might implement it, and that also emphasizes the benefits for them of implementing these practices. How are we going to deliver this? Well, we have 2 course units that have been created. The first is one they take when they enroll in the program, and this helps them to define the ERA implementation plan. And then the second is at the end in their last semester of research, where we check the implementation and they get feedback from the instructional team as well as from other students on the implementation of these practices. And I just want to highlight there are many people involved in the Treasure program from around the university. And this is just to give you a scope of, or a sense of the different faculties and individuals that we have involved in designing and delivering this program. And also to thank those individuals for helping us with this extensive project. Okay. So I think these 2 projects highlight 2 different ways that we're looking at enhancing research and developing potential for research and the use of open science and reproducible research skills at our university. And we hope that those programs, as we develop them further, will also help us to enhance research and be implementable in other places.
For those of you who are interested in learning more about meta-research and research improvement, in a couple of weeks in September 22nd to 24th in Berlin, we are hosting the Responsible Research in Action Unconference. And in this unconference, researchers are coming together to work on 10 different projects to improve research culture and practice. And we have all kinds of different projects available that you can sign up for and contribute to. But generally speaking, every project is looking to create tools or resources to improve research culture and practice in the research community broadly. Registration did close on Monday. However, if you would still like to join us, please send an email to our email address and we can fit you into a project that you might like to work on. And with that, that closes the things that I had planned to talk to you about today. So I'm happy to welcome questions, comments, or emotional outbursts if you have them.